Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Test Tubes and Cauldrons, a podcast where we talk about the science behind spirituality. In this episode, we are actually going to start a new series called Science and the Occult Through the Ages. Each episode, we're going to be focusing on a specific time period and discussing important interactions between science, the occult, and also influential people from both realms and the lingering effects they've had on our communities. But before we get into this, let's do our what happened on this day. It is currently July 19th, 2021, and on this day, Rosalind Sussman Gallo, an American biophysicist, shared the 1977 Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine, making her the second woman to win the Nobel Prize for the development of radioimmunoassays, or RIAs, of peptide hormone. Radioimmunoassays brought about a revolution in biological and medical research. With her coworkers, she applied RIA to study the physiology of the peptide hormones insulin, ACTH, growth hormone, and also to throw light upon the pathogenesis of disease caused by abnormal secretion of these hormones. This was pioneering work that opened diabetes research in many new directions, and because of this, she's actually been called the Madame Curie of the Bronx. All right, so let's go ahead and then dive into our first case study. And we decided to start with the classical period. But before we actually get into any of this, I think it's probably very prudent for us to define what we mean by the classical period.
500 to 323 BC is like the formal period where we're referring to when we say the classical period. So it's immediately following the Archaic period and preceding the Hellenistic period. The 323 BC is because Alexander the Great died on this date, and he had a massive influence on Greek culture. He was particularly expansionist, and because he was so expansionist, he ended up colonizing vast swathes of the world. And of course, this intermingling of cultures had a huge influence on both science and the occult. Other influential things that happened during this time: colonization and wars with Persia, which again had a large influence on Greek culture. It's also important to note, and I think Fel can probably elaborate on this more, that different Greek city-states had quite different cultures during this time, and our records are largely from Athens for large periods of this. So when we're talking about Greece, just bear in mind we're not always talking about Greece as a whole. This period contrasts with the later Hellenistic period, which saw even more expansion and cultural mixing.
We're specifically talking about classical Greece and not the Hellenistic period, because the Hellenistic period is so unique compared to this period, and there's not as much fun stuff, in my opinion, in the Archaic period. Or I should say, our evidence for things in the Archaic period are not as strong. A lot of our early science stuff was heavily influenced by the Attic philosophers, and Attic refers to Attica. Attica is the region that Athens is in. Generally, when people say Attic or Attica, they're referring to Athens.
I also wanted to bring up that, yes, we will be talking about the role that is played in science, but the idea of science in the kind of modern sense and the scientific method that we know today, that hadn't really been formalized yet. But there were individuals who were concerned with documenting and studying the nature of our reality, and we'll talk about a lot of those today. But those individuals were often philosophers more so than they were formally scientists. And another thing to mention about philosophers is that they were, one, elites a lot of the time, so that biases their perspective. Record keeping was also not always perfect. So we do have some records, but sometimes those records are secondhand accounts of what an individual said or taught. So that's, again, just something to bear in mind when we're recounting these individuals' perspectives. We don't necessarily have a full picture of that.
I also want to say that I specifically focused my research, and I wrote some headings and stuff in this. I specifically focused on things that I could find in the intersection of philosophy, the occult, and science, because there is a lot of mathematics from this time period that when I was looking into it, I was like, oh, this really doesn't have anything to do with the occult. So sometimes there was actually quite a bit of a separation, usually in the mathematics sphere more than the scientific sphere or the natural sciences, because those were often tied with beliefs of life. So that was where we focused a lot of our energy. I think we also decided to, or I'll have to look, but I think we decided to skip astronomy and stuff because I feel like astronomy could be literally its whole other own thing. This is a brief overview. So some of these things I think we've talked about before or we'll talk about again in the future, but we could literally make a whole new podcast just talking about all of the things that happened in the classical period.
Yeah, actually, in fact, in doing research for this episode, we came across quite a few individuals that we were just like, we don't have enough time to cover them in the depth that we want to. So we might actually do another series about influential people who were at kind of this intersection between science and the occult. Keep an eye out for that too. But yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the next part.
So materialist philosophy is where we're going to start today. Greek philosophers had quite a preoccupation with the elements, and this was because they were trying to narrow down what formed the essence of everything. So this was the first principle, or arc, which means beginning. So this started off with Thales, and he was a mathematician and philosopher who posited that water formed the first principle of all life. And this might seem strangely prescient today, given that we know how essential water is for life, for reactions like hydrolysis, for the structure of proteins. And Thales came to this conclusion by looking at the actual properties of water, so its willingness to adopt particular shapes. So if you put it into a container, it spreads out into that shape. And the fact that it's so apparently able to change its state, so freezing into ice or condensing and evaporating into steam, it seemed to show that it could take many different forms. And so he took this as evidence that water could condense to make different materials. Its ability to mix readily with other substances also added to this effect. Although Thales wasn't strictly correct about water being the essence of everything, his understanding of it as an essential solvent was actually remarkable for a writer of around 600 BC. And I guess I wanted to pass over to Astra as well on how prescient this potentially was and how important water is to our understanding of science today.
Very interesting that Thales came up with this kind of theory just based upon the physical observations of freezing and then melting and the evaporation of water into steam, because there is some evidence to suggest that water actually has memory and retains a memory structure of solutes that have been so diluted that they're no longer measurable in solution. And these studies were performed using a method called X-ray crystallography. And this actually showed alterations in the structure of water after being exposed to different solutes. It's actually been a while since I have read these papers, but from what I recall, they dissolved certain solutes into water. Some were actually dissolvable, some were hydrophobic in nature, and so they weren't actually dissolved, but they were at least in solution, so it formed a mixture. And then they left in for a period of time. They either heavily diluted things that were water soluble, or did removed any particulates left over in the mixture, and then they were able to freeze the solution. And they performed X-ray crystallography after then. I believe they then let it melt to see if the water would retain memory of that particular solute. I'll be sure to link the studies down below if you're curious and you can read it for yourself. They were able to see, again, a difference between the water and its structure after exposure to different solutes. And there's actually a very fascinating discussion about this in a book called The Beginner's Guide to the Universe by Massimo Citro, which is a book that I continuously recommend quite highly. But anyways, within the occult community, and based on this hypothesis that water does have memory, it's actually thought that this could be a potential basis of medicinal tinctures and why heavily diluted solutions still retain their medicinal properties even after the solute has been removed. Now, granted, we cannot rule out the role of placebo effect likely involved in these reports, but I think it's fascinating all the same.
I think it would be really cool to see some more dynamic structural studies like NMR to look at this, because obviously we know that structures in water particularly can change quite quickly. So that would be something that would be really cool to see as an update.
It might also be interesting to engage some maybe newer technologies like cryo-EM, things that can allow us to view things on a more structural, also 3D level, to see if we can see any macro differences when exposed to certain solutes. But yeah, that's a discussion for another time, perhaps.
So that was Thales, and he was kind of really the beginning of this materialist philosophy. And he actually taught other philosophers. So these ideas about the elements began to take root. Later philosophers who studied his teachings included Anaximenes. I've probably horribly mispronounced that. I really do apologize. But he held that air was actually the first principle. This was because of its invisible nature and apparent infinite presence. Its relation to breath was also quite striking for him. He observed the process of condensation and posited that increased density would cause air to precipitate into matter. So stone would be a very condensed form of air in this model. This isn't strictly true in a scientific sense, but I still think that the observational power of philosophers was quite striking because they'd observed things precipitate and they had drawn this observation and tried to generalize it. The idea of breath and its identification with the soul will also come up later, but we'll talk about that in the future. Astra, did you want to mention the idea of density here?
So the idea of increased density causing something with a lighter density to precipitate to something heavier is actually a concept that I've seen before when we're discussing energy in a spiritual sense, and essentially how pure energy is truly nothing. But when it comes into contact with something with more, quote unquote dense, like density, it then transform into matter. And this is my personal UPG here more than any thing with scientific or really occult basis. But I personally believe that the spiritual energy that a lot of people experience and talk about within witchcraft and the occult is actually more of a liminal energy that exists between this pure energy that has no form and material energy, or the energy as we define it scientifically.
So we're kind of moving on from this idea of elemental monism and elements forming the whole basis of everything onto this idea of change and change dictating the nature of things. So Heraclitus, another philosopher, had this idea of change and opposing forces forming the first principle of everything in the universe, rather than something material. And fire would be used to represent this motive character. It's subtle, it's mobile, it's able to penetrate and devour. It can be seen as beneficent in terms of the sun. So this was perceived to be also related to one's communication with the divine. So water, for example, was perceived to be within humans, and the level of wetness or dryness of one's soul was directly correspondent to one's ability to communicate with the divine. So that fire, that dryness would allow communication, which is really interesting actually, because it expands our idea of the sort of elemental pantheon, if you like, and it also starts to take it into a more kind of spiritual idea. So the ideas about the innate elemental arc eventually evolved into the ideas we understand today concerning the four classical elements. So most people are aware of these even outside of the occult. They are earth, air, water, and fire. Rejecting the monism of previous philosophers, this theory proposed that all things were comprised of some combination of these elements. In particular, Aristotle expands on the nature of these elements via what he and some previous thinkers considered to be their essential qualities. So this would be fire being hot and dry, air hot and wet, water cold and wet, and earth being cold and dry. Despite elemental theory having given way to the theory of states of matter in modern science, so solid, liquid, gas, and plasma, it's had a profound and lasting effect on occultism. So you could say elemental correspondences, for example, astrology, ceremonial altars, and I think, Astra, you've mentioned that these come up in alchemy as well, right?
So these ideas do come up in alchemy quite often, actually. And I recall learning about these mostly in my studies of alchemical herbalism, where when developing a tincture or a kind of solution to ease an ailment of some kind, you have to consider the ailment itself, what it is affecting, so the area of the body. Some people have used the word humors to describe the kind of this process, although in alchemical herbalism it's a little bit different. And so you take the ailment and look at it from many different perspectives, and then kind of try and determine what element it fits under, considering the hot, cold, dry, wet characteristics. And then you create a solution that is the opposite to what the ailment is, to bring everything back into balance. That's kind of the main idea, is to return back to a balanced state. And again, a similar idea is applied in traditional alchemy as well. We see these separations of the elements in these descriptions with hot versus cold and wet and dry quite often. So it's a very common occurrence.
And I also ought to point out that elemental theory was not unique to ancient Greece. Actually, many cultures had their own elemental theories. For example, there's a 5-element theory in Chinese thought, or there are later classifications owing to the physical characteristics of things, which emerged in the Islamic Golden Age. But I'm just mentioning the 4 elements because they are so instrumental to our understanding of the occult today. So this elemental theory did not only form a major part of the occult, but also made strides in our understanding of the universe. Aristotle asserted that the light elements, so fire and air, moved away from the center of the universe, and that the heavier elements moved towards it. In this way, a spherical earth would be formed, and this contrasted with the thoughts of earlier philosophers like Thales, who believed in a flat earth. He also reconciled the circular movements of the wandering stars by the idea that they must be formed from a fifth material, ether. So this was pretty fascinating and quite ahead of his time, I guess, thought. But let's talk a little bit more about Aristotle and his views and his development on science.
And just because I always get this confused, the like order of like the big three main philosophers that people always talk about. I mean, there's like a bunch of philosophers, but the main ones that people talk about, the main lineage is Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. And I always used to forget, and still do, forget the order. So it goes Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle. So Aristotle's more recent, Socrates is later. Just so you structure roughly in your head who we're talking about or when we're talking about. So Aristotle, a lot of people consider to be an early scientist in the way of, I mean, like we talked about, they didn't really conceptualize it like that. So scientia was knowledge of necessary causes that is essential to forming an understanding of nature. Aristotle did like kind of early forays into epistemology. He was considered to be kind of one of the first empiricists, meaning he very much went on like the senses, like things that you could see, touch, taste, hear, etc. He also worked to come up with classifications for animals. I believe it was around 500 species roughly. Empiricism is basically this idea that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience, which is kind of starkly different than I would say a lot of earlier philosophers who were kind of more mystically inclined. Aristotle actually had a lot of critiques of some of like the earlier philosophers as well. They all kind of critiqued each other. So I think in that way Aristotle was more physically and motivated in that regard to sort of seek out the physical and then maybe how it connected to the divine there as opposed to the divine and then seeking the divine out in nature. That's kind of a distinction that makes sense. A lot of people look at Aristotle and see him kind of doing like a proto-scientific method. Like he didn't like really experiment, but he would go about in a certain way, gathering data, discovering patterns and inferring explanations from these things, as opposed to just theorizing about them. He would go out and like seek examples and come up with hypotheses, and then he wouldn't really like test them like we would know in the scientific method, but he would go out and basically try to see if he was right.
I mean, yeah, I agree. Like I do think that Aristotle definitely had, I don't want to say less scientific because observation is like one of the core tenets of science when it comes to developing a hypothesis. But I think it just speaks to the almost intelligence that Aristotle and other classical philosophers had at the time, taking the observations that are very physical in nature and things you can actually visibly see, and then making relatively accurate, actually, hypotheses about how things work at the time that we've then been able to verify experimentally in modern times with the technology that we've developed. Yeah, I just think it definitely seems to me more of just like it's not even ancient, but like older version of the scientific method that's like less relied upon things that we can't see and focusing more just on like observations that you would notice by walking outside.
Right, and Aristotle differed from Plato in that regard, where Aristotle sought out things physically in the world, whereas Plato kind of started. It's so hard to describe this without using like a lot of philosophical jargon, but whereas Plato kind of started with the ideas. A good way that I've seen it phrased is Aristotle used induction from examples alongside deduction, whereas Plato just kind of relied on deduction and it's kind of he already had a basis of like instead of seeking ideas out in the world, he sought them kind of based on a preconceived theory.
Yeah, I think it's a difference of like working within an established like personal paradigm, which is kind of what Plato had, versus Aristotle, who didn't automatically put his observations into a specific framework. Instead, he allowed the observations to kind of explain maybe their own thing.
Often forgotten but very influential philosopher was Empedocles. So Empedocles is kind of in this kind of chain of influence. If we're looking at this from chain of influence, he's like much earlier than a lot of these folks. Empedocles was actually around the same timeline of Pausanias, although Pausanias was younger than him. Empedocles was like an influence to Pythagoras and later Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the Orphics and he influenced a lot of people, but no one really knows who he is. So Empedocles is down here. So he's the one that really kind of started the four elemental theory, although he didn't call them elements, he called them roots. So he posited these four roots, which we all know: air, earth, fire, water. And this was all put in his sort of treatise on nature, which was all written in hexameter. He wrote his scientific theories in hexameter, which I think is hilarious.
We need to do more of that because scientific papers are boring to read. It's not something we're really interested in.
It makes it did make research a little bit difficult trying to like parse through what he was actually saying. And what's interesting with Empedocles is that these four roots were also identified with the gods. So there was Zeus, Hera, Nestus, and Aidoneus. Although I don't think Aidoneus and Nestus were gods. They were... Oh, no, just kidding. Nestus is, I guess, another name for Persephone. Didn't know that. Aidoneus was like a hero, though. Yeah, so he never used the term element. He just kind of used the term roots. And what's interesting about Empedocles is that he did not believe, he very much had like this idea that matter is neither created nor destroyed. Empedocles very much believed that as well, that sort of everything that is in existence is already in existence. The difference being if change occurs, that's how things appear to come into existence and appear to leave existence. And these changes he called love and strife. These were sort of these mystical, but also in his mind, physical ideas. They were eternal and unalterable. And these were very much divine powers. So love was when things unified. Love was the attractive force. So when forces were attracted together, they were attracted. It was the force of love. And when things were separated or split apart, that was strife that drove them apart. And Empedocles also very much was all about this idea of cycles. He had this cosmic cycle, were once in strife will then be brought together in love, and things that were once in love will be driven apart by strife. And it's kind of this death and rebirth cycle. In fact, he was one of the few, just like Pythagoras, one of the few philosophers who believed that eating animals was polluting to the body and blood was polluting. Again, Empedocles could probably get his own thing because he was extremely influential, and kind of everyone who came after him was kind of standing on his shoulders.
So I guess we're going to move on to Pythagoras, and I feel like, again, it's impossible to cover everything, but I wanted to bring up some of the principles which make Pythagoras so important in the occult. And I would like to do a tally of our episodes and which ones have the name Pythagoras in, because I would bet it is like over half at this point. But if you don't already know who he was a philosopher, a polymath, a mathematician. He traveled very widely from Egypt, Phoenicia, even as far as India. And due to strife in the original island he inhabited in Greece, he eventually moved to southern Italy in Croton, where he taught philosophy. There's also some evidence of a mystic cult surrounding him and Pythagoreanism, but this is thought to be quite close to Orphism. The problem is, of course, that these are mystery cults, so we don't know too much. If you don't know about Orphism, it's a mystery cult largely concerned with the mysteries of Dionysus or Dionysus. So there's some kind of already interesting things there going on with communing with the divine. But talking about his influence on the modern occult, we come across this idea of opposing forces. This came originally from Heraclitus, a materialist philosopher, but as mentioned, was developed by Empedocles with this idea of the cosmic cycle. And the idea of opposing forces forming the basis of all things. So this included the development of odd and even numbers, which of course was essential in the development of the sciences. The idea of a definite and indefinite principle. But because there was this definite and indefinite principle splitting things down into two, there must be some kind of third guiding force overseeing these. So this was the principle of union, which was also conceptualized as God. And that made its way very much into Hermetic thought, Neoplatonic thought. He had this idea that the world itself was God in process. And because of everything's relation to number, every arithmetical or geometric theorem became, in this view, another window into the secret heart of things. Number became a kind of god, a revealer, and the philosophy of number a kind of religion or mystery. So it was almost using arithmetic to decode the divine in some kind of abstract way. And we've already mentioned, Phil did a really good rundown in our frequency and vibrations episode, the music of the spheres. This was a sort of divine form of music. But Pythagoras also, at least in part, originated the idea of the soul. So this idea of the opposing forces, principles of change and flux would be applied to the soul versus the body. And you'd have this threefold division of pure thought, perception, and desire. And of course, you can see how people divide things into material, soul, and spirit in kind of the modern occult world, and they apply this to basis of how magic works. So you can see that it's very lasting even today.
I will say that, and we'll do an episode on this at a later date, I think, but if people are curious about like arithmetic and like geometria and how that all kind of like relates to nature, that is a fantastic topic to look into. It is very math heavy, so if you don't like math, don't do it. But it's a great way to see the connections between the divine and the influence of the divine in the natural world by just looking at nature around you and the patterns that you see, and then boiling those patterns down to mathematical formulas, which we can do and it has been done before. So if you're curious, like geometry is a great place to start. I'll link a couple books in our episode description that like I have found very interesting regarding this topic, and you can look into it if it interests you.
So we have a section here which is titled The Humours, and then it says, or humours if you're not a stinky Brit. I don't know who wrote this. But yeah, let's talk about the humours, and because they closely relate to what we've already talked about when we refer to the elements. But they actually play a massive, massive role, arguably too large a role, in the development of medicine. So this was the idea that the body comprised four things: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And these were probably from early healers observing bodily fluids in unwell patients. The substances weren't thought to be inherently damaging to the body, but they ought to be in balance. For example, if somebody had a cough that was producing catarrh, there might be thought to be a surplus of phlegm, or black bile, and excess of that was associated with cancers, for example. There was also an idea that certain environmental factors might cause a surplus or deficiency in one particular element. And it's not hard to see why observation might cause that. You know, some people with hay fever might have dripping noses, and that might lead you to believe that there's some environmental factor influencing phlegm production. But this interesting thing here is that these were closely associated with the elements and their correspondences. So phlegm would be associated with cold disease, like water. And something I was surprised by was how long this idea persisted. Like, I was seeing things from 1910 still using the idea of the humours. Like, we didn't get germ theory until kind of the early 1900s, I think. I should know this, I'm a microbiologist. I'm sorry, but I haven't researched this. But basically, yeah, we had the idea of humours dictating illness very, very, very late on. So it's been massively influential in modern medicine.
Yeah, I remember reading that one of the things with the Spanish flu was the part of the things that helped was the discovery or the reassessing from the humors into germ theory that kind of helped them. And I think the Spanish flu kind of accelerated some of that because, as you said, it lasted uncomfortably late. A friend of mine was reading Sense and Sensibility, and we were talking about it, and they were talking about treating, I think, Marianne Dashwood. Spoiler alert, but you know, you've had several hundred years, so not several hundred, a couple hundred. Marianne Dashwood gets like a fever, and they're like, it was thought like cured like in some of the theories, and so it was like give her cayenne pepper or something, which is not not what's helpful. I couldn't find a lot of examples of humors in the classical age, at least, which is where we are limiting our evidence to classical age being used for the occult. I know in medieval age there was some examples of humors being used in the occult sphere, but I couldn't quite find any connection between the humors and the occult in the classical age, at least not explicitly. I think now we look back and view them more with a sense of occult and superstition because we know how kind of whack they are. Yeah, I also wonder, this is like a sidebar, and we can talk about this later, but I was thinking about some of these concepts like the humors, and I wonder how one could use them in an occult context, because I feel like there could be something there with certain kinds of herbalism or how related they are to alchemy. I don't know. I was thinking about that. I wonder if there's a way to see them in an occult sense.
Yeah, I think there is. I would have to go back and review some of the early alchemical texts that I read. But there is a connection between them, and we can maybe expand on it more if we do like an alchemy episode, which we probably will once we get into some later eras of like this particular series, and even if we get into just people who had huge influences on alchemy, like Pythagoras and even Plato to an extent. But yeah, you can use it. I'd be curious to know if anybody would use it in the occult, like in your practice today. I'm not really sure how you might do that besides maybe with like alchemy and herbalism. But outside of that, like I think my thing is that they're so outdated, right? And it like doesn't work. And knowing that, I would hesitate to use any of that in my own practice. Like with the alchemical herbalism that I mentioned earlier, when it comes to kind of you could technically claim that it sounds like you use something similar to the humors to like diagnose. I'm saying diagnose, not in like an actual medical way, because I would never do that. I'm not a doctor. But there's more to it than that. Typically, when you're doing alchemical herbalism in that regard, you look at more than just like this simple division of symptoms, and we really dive into like what is causing the symptom, and you get into the science, like a lot of the science behind it, to actually inform what you're going to prescribe to treat. So it's definitely more scientifically vigorous, I think, than the original humors used to be, although it might have been the basis for a lot of those treatments back in the day. In fact, it was. Not might have, it was.
I will also add that Theophrastus, who came after Aristotle, I think he came after Aristotle. He was the first one to link the humors to personalities. Like, so someone with too much blood was a certain way sanguine, I think, which just means blood. That would show sort of, so like someone who was depressed might have too much black bile. He was the one who kind of linked a more, almost like early personality types in a sense.
Classical era Enneagrams over here.
Yeah, basically. I wonder what I would have too much of. Probably too much blood. I don't know. I'm pretty fiery.
You are fiery. We love your hot takes.
I was looking up what role the humors played and the environmental factors which would influence, in theory, the development of these humors. And some of the resources were saying things like, oh, all of these people in these cities in the West, they're really prone to illness, or they have too much black bile. And that makes me think how much of this, like you say, the Enneagram thing, how much of this was actual kind of medical knowledge versus people just being like rude or dismissive about people from other cultures, or just stereotyping other people. It was just sort of amusing to read that.
That's just to say that literally no personality test ever has like legitimate basis, and it's usually always biased in some way.
I'm gonna read these out, okay, because I think they're fun. The 4 temperaments, and like I said, these first described by Theophrastus. I think in his book Characters, which is a really fun little short sassy essay, he like really sasses people. It's hilarious, but it's also a very good example of like how they actually would have viewed things, like what was appropriate and what was inappropriate. Someone who is sanguine was highly talkative, enthusiastic, active, and social. Yep. Choleric tends to be extroverted, independent, decisive, goal-oriented, and ambitious. In Greek thought, this was also violent, vengeful, and short-tempered. Melancholic, I think we kind of know what that is today, but it was a little bit different. It was like thoughtful, reserved, and anxious. So not just like depressed, but also like anxious. Phlegmatic. I don't know. Relaxed, peaceful, quiet, and easygoing. But they also make too many compromises. So those I get the four early personality types. I'm no longer going to ask people what their Enneagram or their Myers-Briggs is. I'm going to ask them what their temperament is. Give me one of the 4 to 4 temperament are you? Everyone in our Discord has to let us know what temperament they are. I should add that as a role.
There you go. What temperament you are, we should. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Actually, it's really interesting though. If you like think about what you just read out, and also if you look at the elements associated with each of the humors, they're very related to those planets and the attributes there as well. For instance, blood, with actually the way in which it was described to kind of suggest, I don't know, maybe like I was thinking Mars at first, right? Kind of like what I was thinking initially. Mars, maybe a little bit of Venus in there. I'm assuming Yellow Bow was the like super enthusiastic one. It was the second one that you read, and it reminded me a lot of like sun attributes. Then the Black Bow, which is associated with Earth, kind of felt more like Taurus vibes, right? Which seems very like Jupiterian, a little bit of like Venusian as well. And then finally, the last one was Phlegm, which is associated with water, and definitely gave me like the personality you described at least seemed very lunar based in my personal opinion. It was really interesting to also see maybe some planetary correspondences associated with the humors in addition to, and like the personality types that were developed alongside them. Okay, we're getting so off topic.
Kind of related to the humors was pneuma. That's how I pronounce pneuma. Pneuma just means breath. I mean, think a word, pneumonia. Pneuma was both considered physical and also metaphysical. And this kind of relates back to, God, now I'm not going to be able to pronounce this. Anaximenes? Maybe. I'll go with that. To the thoughts on air as the first principle, and then the sort of Stoics that also embrace this idea of pneuma, very much like breath being sort of the central and the seat of the soul in a sense. In a lot of ways, pneuma was like an air is essential to life, and life is essential to, thinking and everything. And so pneuma in a lot of senses was also very much associated with the heart and the mind, or at least our concepts of the heart and the mind. The psychic, according to Diocles and Pythagoras, the psychic pneuma mediates between the heart, regarded as the seat of mind. Pneuma was definitely a very important concept, both in the divine sphere and also in the medical sphere as well. I don't know if Henny, if you want to expand on that.
It was a really long-standing concept, and it could be applied to everything. So it could be applied to both matter, but also to one's soul, and it's not necessarily clear where those boundaries are drawn. In Stoic cosmology, for example, there was this idea of logos versus matter. So the matter would be something that isn't destroyed, but the logos is the driving fire or divine fire. And that divine fire could be compared to the ideas we see later in Gnosticism, for example, of the sort of divine spark within oneself. So these kind of similar ideas of forces driving the soul. But of course, because this was related to the breath of life, and there were previous ideas from Pythagoras with duality, we also have the connection of pneuma within the body to the kind of more spiritual divine spark and the kind of correspondence between those. Some believe pneuma to be transmitted in the manner of vibration, so similar to kind of music. And the more psychic idea of pneuma, this divine spark, it could have influenced later occult ideas, the macrocosm and the microcosm. This is briefly mentioned in The Black Art, Spirited Cavendish. Something I wanted to bring up was, if there's this idea of pneuma which can be somewhat altered by our words or our actions, could this be kind of a mechanism by which the ancient Greeks believed that magic worked? Because we obviously know that magic was practiced in the classical period in ancient Greece. I would argue maybe not, because philosophers who were hypothesizing about this were not really the people who were doing folk magic. Like, they were quite disparate groups of people. But I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
I do think, however, that even though they might not have been practicing folk magic, it wouldn't surprise me if they might have been practicing some form of ceremonial magic. And when we're talking about ceremonial magic, the vibration of divine names is one way to connect with the divine. And in fact, it's a very good way to do so in my personal experience. And so that vibration of the name might have been something that was more commonly used amongst philosophers rather than your typical folk practice that includes, foraging for herbs and so on and so forth. So in that regard, actually, it might certainly be a mechanism by which they believed magic worked, simply because at the time they also didn't have the same amount of tools that we had, right? And with philosophy being such a big part of the classical era, it makes sense that we would look at it from more like a theurgic perspective versus more of like the practical magic that we see in like witchcraft in modern times. So it certainly may have been a theory, maybe not the primary theory. I definitely think there was probably more to it at the time, but again, that vibration of divine names was something that's very important in ceremonial magic, and it's something that I could see perhaps Greek philosophers maybe connecting with and engaging in. I don't know if there's any historical basis for that, so don't quote me.
I'm gonna disagree. So there is evidence to suggest that like they did view things like music as being divine, and they viewed philosophy itself and thinking and musing out loud about these things as at least being connected to the divine. At least Plato did. So I think in that way, perhaps Numa could be connected to some sort of mysticism. I wouldn't really say magic, but I would say more mysticism. I don't think they would have made that connection. Maybe as individuals, if they knew like pneumatic theory, they might have made that connection. But I mean, we definitely don't see that at a state level beyond the philosophers. I mean, if we think about the philosophers too, a lot of them were kind of branded as heretics in a lot of ways, which people always like to forget. Definitely wouldn't have been a common thought, I don't think. And if they did think that way, there's no evidence that I can think of beyond just them thinking that like music is divine or philosophy is divine. I don't know if they would have thought like, oh, I can harness this pneuma and make it do something. We don't really see that sort of thing come into play until the Hellenistic period. They could have been, but from what I have seen, I'm not super well versed in philosophers, but from what I've seen, it at least would not have been common.
Actually, that makes sense if you think about how important like arithmetic was at the time, right? If we're truly trying to find ways to explain the universe in terms of numbers, it makes sense that perhaps more artistic ideas of like harnessing one's breath to engage with the divine might not have been so commonplace given some of the tendencies towards empirical observation.
I have a hunch, but I don't have evidence to back this up. But since you mentioned theurgy and pneuma, I think it might have come more into play in the Neoplatonist philosophy, which was not until later in the Hellenistic era. Don't quote me on that. I would have to look it up, but I think that probably its introduction into ceremonial magic might have come from those influences, which were, again, later on, so not during the classical era.
One of our last examples here is Hippocrates. And I wanted to bring up Hippocrates because I think he is kind of a juxtaposition against a lot of this. Hippocrates was very critical of a lot of intermingling of the divine and the natural world, just because he saw it in a lot of ways being not necessarily abused, but that like people were relying on superstition to cure diseases. For those of you who don't know, Hippocrates was a very influential physician. And to this day, at least in the United States, doctors have to swear the Hippocratic Oath. One of the things that he said in his book on the sacred disease, it is thus with regard to the disease called sacred. It appears to me to be no wise more divine nor more sacred than other diseases, but has natural causes from the originates like other affections. Men regard its nature and cause as divine from ignorance and wonder. So he did not view disease as being divine, which is like starkly different from what we see preceding him. A lot of people, a lot of physicians who came before him and a lot who came after him, like those who ran the temples of Asclepius or of Paean Apollo, they viewed disease as something that the gods afflicted you with, and that the only way to cure it was to appease the gods. And they would go through the temple. And I think we've talked about incubation before, where they would go to the temple, fall asleep, you'd wake up, and whatever dream you had would lead you to your cure. Hippocrates was kind of like, that's nonsense. That's silly. So he worked really, really hard to try to treat people based on natural evidence instead of the divine. Although he did kind of pioneer a lot of like humor theory, humorism, but like granted, like it was, to him, that was the more scientific approach. Yeah, he tried to look at a natural cure and a natural cause as opposed to a divine one, which kind of got him in trouble in a lot of ways. He did a lot of really good work. So one of the quotes, a quote in Latin about him is, God, no one who speaks Latin come after me. It was like vis meditrix naturae, the healing power of nature. So he very much saw things that stem from nature can be healed through nature. That's Hippocrates, who I, in my opinion, like, I don't think he's like fully juxtaposed to the things that we talked about before, but he's not really like of the philosophy vein. He's very much like this is physically what's happening and here's what I'm physically going to do about it.
Which I think is important. Like that kind of grounding in physical reality is an important aspect, I think, within the occult community that sometimes we forget. And like often we hear this phrase, right, mundane over magical, which I think is overused to an extent and isn't necessarily entirely true because mundane things can be magical. I think Hippocrates kind of encapsulates this idea of like systematically looking at your experiences or your problems and then saying like, if this is a natural problem, like it can probably be handled by like natural means. We don't necessarily need to like come up with some like spiritual or like magical solution to everything, right? Like if you need money, go like find a job. You can use magic to help influence it, sure, but like just doing a job still isn't going to do anything. So if we want to like draw similarities kind of between Hippocrates and his philosophy in like modern times, that could be a potential way to do it. I love Hippocrates stuff. He's one of my favorites. But I definitely think that like as a community, perhaps we should return and like really read the and like study the philosophy of many of the philosophers and the mathematicians and the scientists that weren't actually scientists because science didn't really exist at the time, their theories and their ideas, because a lot of them have very well informed and like well thought out kind of ideas of how the world works. And it's still relatively spiritual because at the time, again, science wasn't this like fully fledged paradigm like it is today. That's something that I definitely want to do moving forward, is look into more ancient philosophers and just kind of read them without prejudice and get their perspectives.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Hippocrates was the OG mundane over magical. The one thing I will say about philosophers is I think they are very good at showing how things might have been, how science and the occult might have been, mixed together in some regard. However, I will say that they're different than the common thought, like way different than the common thought, to the point of, R.I.P. Socrates. It got them all in a lot of trouble just because like they were forward thinkers. That taught me that this was like that ancient Greece was this place where science and the occult dance wonderfully together, because that's not necessarily the case.
And it doesn't mean they were correct either. Let's just
Yeah.
be forward with that as well.
Oh yeah, they were so wrong. They were wrong with confidence. As much as they're fun to study, they are very much indicative of their class and their gender and their place, like Athens. Even though like Pythagoras was not Athenian, his stuff was really proliferated by the Athenians.
A lot of them wouldn't have considered what they were thinking or doing magic either. I mean, there's obviously these connections to the divine, but that was often seen as kind of distinct from magic in ancient Greece. So that's something also to bear in mind. Like, yes, those influenced later concepts in the occult, but they thought they were just kind of decoding sort of the nature of reality. So we can't kind of reverse engineer these principles and look at them through that lens. We have to recognize that they were trying to understand the nature of everything surrounding them with the observation powers that they had.
Yeah, it's like Phil said, it's more really like mysticism
Right.
than, and even just like spirituality in general versus like actual magic in the terms that people think of today.
Right. Like there were no casual Pythagoreans. They were very much an ascetic cult. If you were a Pythagorean, like you were a Pythagorean. There's no way that it was necessarily intermingled in the everyday life. Although I would love to see how it was. I don't know if we'll ever know, unfortunately. But just know that this is just, like I said, this is a brief overview. Several books could be written about each individual. Like,
yeah,
literally.
if you are interested, like please do your own research. We will include a couple of books below based on like our personal recommendations. Bella, I'm sure you have many. I have a couple that I read, and you can peruse those at your leisure. But we're gonna go ahead and have that be the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening. This was definitely outside of our normal scope of things, but we hope you enjoyed kind of the general overview of the classical era and how science and the occult mingled together a bit for a time. And we will see you next week. Thanks for listening, everybody, and have a great day.